This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 21st chapter. Jesus said to the people, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, and dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will surely respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him the produce at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. This is the gospel of the Lord, and you may be seated. So I've been blessed with allergies, so I've got to wet my whistle here, and we'll go into the sermon. So when I sat down to write my sermon, or at least begin the process of writing my sermon, the first thing that came to me is, nuts. A little stronger version of that, because this is a really, really hard text. It's filled with all sorts of violence, and I really didn't know what to do with it. Martin Luther talked about how we are called to squeeze the gospel, to get the good news out of the gospel. Well, I really needed a vice grip or just a vice to really squeeze the good news out of this gospel. I was really, really struggling. There's so much violence in this gospel, and it's hard to get past that. So the gospel is about this landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around the vineyard, dug a wine press in it, and then built a watchtower, which was a place of safety. Then he leased it to some tenants and went to another country. And then it was time for the harvest. And so the landowner sent his slaves to go to the tenants and collect his produce. But instead of the tenants giving his produce to the slaves that the landowner sent, there was this act of violence toward them. And the gospel says that they seized the slaves, they beat one of the slaves, they killed another, and then stoned another. So then he sent even more slaves to go to the vineyard to collect the produce. And it makes sense that the landowner would have done that because, after all, he owned the land, and so he deserved a portion of the produce. So he sent another group of slaves, and they were treated in the same manner. There was all this violence against them as well. And then he decides to send his son. The landowner sends the son, and the son goes there, and the landowner thought, surely they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. And then the disciples talk about how the landowner is certainly going to put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants. It seems like there's just violence upon violence upon violence. Where is the good news of this text? I don't know about you, but I've been really dismayed by all the events of the world. The threat of nuclear holocaust, nuclear war, the threat of just being outside and worrying about people shooting randomly like what happened in Las Vegas. It's a scary time, and people struggling, talking to one another, just in day-to-day life because of anxiety in our world. And it's just a really big struggle, it seems, in this day and age. And then I approach this gospel text and start to think, well, what is this all about? It was a hard text to pull the good news out. So then I decided to take a step back, pull out from the text, and maybe fly over at 30,000 feet to try to understand the text. And then I realized a very simple thing, that our gospel text for today points to the cross. Certainly what happened on the cross was also a violent act when Jesus was put to death. But that violent act was not the end of the story. That violence absorbed the violence of the world. Because of Jesus' death and his resurrection, there is hope in the midst of a world filled with violence. The cross absorbs the violence of the world. One theologian wrote about it in this way, but then all of a sudden it's not the same, because rather than return violence for violence, in the cross of Jesus, God absorbs our violence and responds with life, with resurrection, with Jesus triumphant over death and offering not retribution, but peace. The theologian David Lose goes on to say, and for me this week, that good news means in part that violence does not and will not have the last word. That the only response to violence is not more violence. That tragedy and death and loss and hatred are in the end no match for love and life and forgiveness and peace. And I would add God's grace as well, God's unmerited love for us. So in this world of violence, in this world of struggling to be in relationship with one another, look to the good news of the cross, which is the ultimate symbol of God's grace for us. We did not do anything to earn our salvation, to earn God's unmerited love. Jesus' death and resurrection was given to us as a gift. Mr. Rogers talked about how in the midst of struggle, in the midst of crises, in the midst of violence, to always look to the helpers. And I would add that we could look to God's grace in the midst of this scary world that we live in. And we get glimpses of the good news of the gospel of God's grace all over the place when we pay attention and just look around. Lately, I've been really mired in the news of our world, the struggles of our community, and it can get really difficult to remember that God is watching over us. We get a narrow view of the world. And I think when we get a narrow view of the world, we're called to get some perspective, to take a step back. And I had that experience just over these past 3 days. And I'd like to share with you about that experience and my experience of seeing God's grace all over the place in the midst of this scary world, this uncertain world that we live in. Last Thursday morning, I flew down to Chicago to present at a national counselor educator conference. And as many of you know, I lived in Chicago for about 5 years. I went to seminary there and experienced a lot of life in Chicago as well. And I had the opportunity to stay at my school, Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. It was much cheaper to stay there than downtown Chicago where the conference was at. There was also the Chicago Marathon, so rooms were like $300 a night downtown Chicago. I got my room for $40, so it wasn't bad. And I went to Chicago fully expecting just to have a very mundane trip and to present our research, and that was going to be it. But I ended up going on kind of a spiritual journey of sorts and seeing God's grace all over the place, and it was incredible. It all started when I arrived at the campus, and I walked to the front desk, and I happened to know who was working the front desk on that day. Her name is Kim. And she came around from the desk and gave me a big hug. And immediately she started crying. And she said, "I'm so sorry, Aaron, I'm so sorry." I'm like, what are you sorry about? She said, "I'm sorry that I wasn't able to grieve with you when you lost your daughter, Helena." For those of you that don't know, we lost a daughter 8 years ago, back in April of 2008. So I guess that was 9 years ago, already be 10 years in April. And she spent 12 months of her life in Chicago. And that's where she received her heart surgeries as well. So Helena kind of became the baby of LSTC, and Kim was certainly a part of that as well. And so she started crying, and then I started crying. And it was a powerful experience. It was a moment of God's grace. It was so powerful to have that experience that somebody on campus remembered Helena and was willing to cry with me. It was an incredible experience. After that, I was kind of shaken, and that began my spiritual journey of sorts. And walking around campus, all of these memories came flooding back, wonderful memories of being with Helena. Then I drove down to the conference and talked to my advisor, Dr. Korsel, and her husband, Al. And they agreed to go with me to the hospital. I worked as a hospital chaplain on the south side of Chicago. And that was the same hospital, too, where Helena received her heart surgeries. In fact, I started September 1 of 2006, and she had her first surgery August 29th of 2006, I should say. And so it's a very special place for me, where I worked and experienced a lot of life, and where Helena had her surgeries as well. 7 years ago, when I was in Chicago, I dropped a bunch of tiles off at the hospital, ceramic tiles that were given to us by the hospital after Helena died. And the idea is that you decorate the tiles, and then they fire the tiles, and then they hang them up in the hospital as kind of a memorial or remembrance of the children that have received surgeries in that place. So I dropped them off 7 years ago, and I had kind of forgotten about them. And so that's why I wanted to go to the hospital. I wanted to see these tiles up on the wall. I knew they had finally been put up, and to visit, too, with my supervisor there as well, Corky. And I have some pictures here. If you want to go to the next one. So that's my advisor, Corky, and then the tiles are in that corner there where I'm pointing. And one of the tiles had Helena's name on it, and her date of birth and her date of death. And it was a moment of God's grace being there and receiving a hug from Corky and another friend, Stacy, who's a chaplain there as well. It was a powerful moment, and powerful to know that Helena's memory is still there at the hospital. If we go to the next one. There's just a closer view of the tiles, and then you can go to the next one. So the person on your left is my friend Stacy, and then the person on your right is a woman named Katie. So Katie is the nurse of the heart surgeon that did Helena's heart surgery. Dr. Ilbawi is the doctor. And so I'm walking down the hall, and Stacy, both Stacy and I are walking down the hall. She calls over Katie and introduces me. And just as I'm about to say Helena's name, she said, "Oh, you're Helena's dad." So this was 12 years ago that we had this heart surgery, and she remembered our daughter. Tears started to flow. This person was randomly walking down the hall. We caught her, and she remembered Helena and talked about how they remember her from time to time and talk about her. And other doctors there remember her as well. So it was a really powerful experience for me, an experience of God's grace, and then to think about all that I experienced in that hospital as well, both good and bad. It was a powerful experience of the grace of God. And just being in Chicago in general, walking around our old neighborhood, all of these memories came back of being with our daughter, both Mary and I, and it was powerful. God's grace was all around. God, you might say, was really, really showing off. Then the last day, just yesterday, I was in my car and reflecting on all of these moments of God's grace. And then it was raining, cats and dogs, and I had a little piece of tin car, and the wipers made the car shake back and forth. And so I was really concentrating, moving forward down the expressway. And all of a sudden, the clouds parted and the sun came out, and then this happened. There was a beautiful rainbow stretched across the sky. Shortly after Helena died, we went to Ireland. So she died in 2008. We traveled to Ireland for 10 days. And on the very last day of our trip, there was a beautiful rainbow stretched across the sky in Ireland, over the beautiful green hills of Ireland. And we took that as a reminder that God is watching over us and that God is taking care of Helena. And then to have that same thing happen on this sort of spiritual journey where I was reconnecting with Helena, I had to pull over. I was crying as I was driving down the freeway. Now, driving down the freeway is a bit of an adventure in Chicago, and so I cut about 4 people off as I'm going into the exit, and I pulled over into a Walgreens parking lot and took this shot and just sat there in tears. It was a powerful, powerful experience of the grace of God in the midst of this uncertain world that we live in. So then I'm at the airport, and I'm getting ready to fly back to Fargo, and I knew I was in the right gate because people had that, deep Minnesota accent. People were, talking Minnesotan, so I felt like I was back with my people again, because in Chicago they have more of a flat A. Darn allergies. So then I sat down and I pulled out my phone, because you don't want to talk to anybody, right? So I pulled out my phone. And Facebook has this weird thing where it'll tell you different memories from years ago, things that happened on that day. And this is what popped up as I'm looking at my Facebook page. It's a reflection that my dad wrote about Helena. Again, another powerful experience. It's a gem. Now, if I make it through without crying, well, I'm doing pretty darn well, but I know you'll forgive me. And this is what my dad wrote. Lessons I learned from my granddaughter, Helena. It has been my privilege as a youth to have attended good public school systems where I learned the basic 3 R's. Beyond that, I attended a fine college of the church where I learned lessons in religion, sociology, psychology, history, and science. From there, I was led to seminary where I studied the prophets, the pastoral epistles, and the mystery of the book of Revelation under the guidance of many fine teachers. But I can honestly say that nothing is more precious than the lessons taught to me by my beautiful granddaughter, Helena. Here are some of the most important lessons that she taught. Number 1, make friends with a patient cat. They make wonderful pillows. Don't be self-conscious. Don't be so self-conscious and uptight about life. That's speaking right to me. Always remain true to your friends, especially those named Baba, Elmo, Dora, Boots, and Backpack, and Cookie. Take your mem-mem, was what she referred to as medicine, with a smile, and it also helps to sing The Wheels on the Bus. Enjoy the fries at McDonald's. A few, or in my case, a lot, won't hurt you. Cut up broccoli. Really, it isn't all that bad. Get out and swing a little, and don't be afraid to shout "wee" when you're having fun. Going out for a ride in the stroller or in the car can do wonders for your disposition. $1 million smile far outweighs any amount of money in the bank. Family is everything, especially when they're all sitting on the same futon watching Elmo. We had a futon in seminary. A heart defect has nothing to do with the amount of love that a heart can share. You can get anything you want from Papa just by flashing your $1 million smile. Grandma will be more than willing to bend the rules and let you splash water all around the kitchen sink. When you go to bed at night, remember all those that love you and who love you. all those you love and who love you. Night-night mama, night-night dada, night-night grandmas and papas, night-night Elmo and Baba and Dora and Boots, and on and on and on. Perseverance pays off, whether it's learning to walk, saying new words, or learning to count. When I say all done, get me out of my chair quick. I've got other things to do and new places to explore. Bravery knows no age limit. This little girl was brave beyond measure. Your mom and dad loved you beyond imagination, and you returned that love with your whole heart. Trust in family. They are there with you during the tough times. Be generous with your waves, and don't be afraid to say hi to everyone you meet. Make friends with books and read your favorite ones over and over. Stop and smell the flowers. A toy may cost $89.50, but a simple basket of fresh laundry can be more fun as you toss it all over the living room and run around with underwear on your head. Your mom and dad made every sacrifice for you, and they will love and hold you dearly forever. In the smile of a child, you catch a glimpse of the face of God. Whenever you pray, always end with a hearty amen. Thank you, Helena. We never had a better teacher. You opened our hearts to the gifts that come from being a part of God's family. You filled our hearts to overflowing with your smiles, your giggles, your hugs, and your bravery. You have given us unconditional love as only our Heavenly Father can give. And with all that you endured, your spirit remained strong and happy. Our days of lessons were much too short, but we have been blessed by all that you have taught us and all the love that we have shared, and we will never forget. God bless, and amen.